Hi, everyone. It's the Catholic CEO, Henry Katarna. Welcome to this Catholic Business Wisdom series. Today, our special guest, Mr. Rafael Morales. He's the principal of Cosmati Architects, and he does church architecture. You're going to be very interested to hear. Rafael, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Henry. How are you?
Well, I'm doing great too. I'm enjoying my time in Texas, and I'm really finding that there's a lot of beautiful church architecture that one can see around here. And so I want to talk to you about that. So Rafael, thanks again for being with us. I think it's a very one of the most important first questions for our audience always is, what is your faith journey? What's happened to you? How are you doing in the faith? Where did you come from in the faith? Maybe you could summarize that for us, please.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to. Thank you. So I am originally from Mexico. So I was born in Mexico and lived in Mexico for the first 10 years of my life when I came to the States. So here in Texas, Houston after that. And so I was born and raised Catholic. My parents, raised me in the sacraments and in the faith. But I would say when I came to the States, and especially when I went to high school, it's natural to ask questions and sometimes to drift away and things like that. But I was actually really blessed, and I completely owe this to my parents, that they got me involved in the youth group at our parish, St. Bernadette, down there in Clear Lake, and just got connected with a really great youth minister who was able to help me ask big questions and have great conversations about the meaning of life, about faith, and about, why we believe what we believe. And I just remember having a lot of great extended conversations with him. And I think it was the first time that I had serious intellectual faith conversations with someone. And it just
Interesting.
left a huge impression on me. And so high school, I was very much on fire. I was very much, just learning and growing in the faith. I also discovered Catholic radio about that time, which was helpful in that as well. When I went to college, I knew I wanted to be an architect. I knew that had always been a huge, interest of mine. But architecture school is all immersive. So, I mean, it's a 24/7 kind of engagement. And so we were always in studio working, and always it seemed like I was just squeezing math in here and there. And so in that certain sense, some of that zeal began to taper off a little bit. But I will say that about two and a half years into my architecture schooling, I began to once again rediscover the faith, primarily through reading the lives of the saints. So St. Francis of Assisi, St. John Bosco was another one, and St. Catherine of Siena. And reading those lives of the saints really kind of ignited another fire in me. And I actually began to discern the priesthood. And so I spent about a year seriously discerning the priesthood, went to some great retreats along the way, but ultimately discerned that, God wanted me to be an architect and to be a father eventually. And so that's what led me to eventually meeting my wife and getting married and fall in love with her. And she, in many ways, is, what has allowed me to take my faith to a new level. She is an incredible woman who has taught me how to be a better man and how to be a man of faith. She has, obviously, together with me, as we have raised our children, our 5 children, we've just, we've walked in this life of faith together. And she has especially shown me the importance of beauty and tradition in the liturgy. She's actually an artist herself. And so she just introduced me to how important it is to have a full liturgical life, both at church, but at home as well. And so that's really what has brought me full circle in life and kind of where I am today.
I love the story because I ask that question to all of our guests. And what I usually find is that it's probably 50-50, Raphael. Some people come to it from the what I call the intellectual approach. You were
Yep.
born and raised Catholic, yes, good. But you also then reinforced your faith and deepened it by the intellectual process. Excuse me. And whereas others get knocked off their horse, so to speak, and they have a profound experience. And we've had people on our show that are, they will tell us a story about a profound experience. So you've come to it from the intellectual sense, but um, your wife has taught you so many things. I was really pleased to hear that part. And you have 5 children, so you're living the faith. And this thing about architecture, I love that part of. And you and I have met before, and we have had some talks about beautiful church architecture. And I want you to know that when I was in high school and we did aptitude tests, I should have become an architect instead of an economist by training, because in high school, I used to draw in certain classes where I probably should have been paying attention. I used to draw castles brick by brick. Just want you to know that I did that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. But so the 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 firm that you have, the architects, you're specializing in church architecture. So truth, beauty, and goodness is something that your wife has mentioned to you, and you've discussed it, I'm sure, because she's an artist. What drew you to that type of architecture?
No, great question. So, it goes back honestly to being being brought up in Mexico and being surrounded by beautiful colonial architecture and having a certain sense of what a church is based on that. Coming to the States and not necessarily recognizing the same kinds of buildings. I mean, I remember the first few times that I went to
Mm.
a church here in the States, and then obviously a lot more contemporary, a lot more modern buildings here. And just even as a 10-year-old kid, thinking that there was a disconnect between the architecture I was seeing and then the faith that we're proclaiming every Sunday at mass, but obviously not fully understanding why that was, right? It was just more of a sense. And then just beginning to understand, I think there's a moment that every architect has where you realize that the things in the world that are built by man were decided on by people, right? Like we decided to build the way we
Yes.
have. And so when you have that realization, it's both a great consolation, but also at the same time, a great burden, because then every time you walk into a building, you realize it could have been a little bit better or different. And so that process of going through architecture school, at first I did not have a specific desire to be a church architect. I just wanted to be an architect and, do beautiful things inspired by my home in Mexico, all the colonial architecture that I think is beautiful and relates to the human person and provides so much beauty and texture to our cities. I wanted to bring some of that to the States. But I didn't specifically want to be a church architect. But it's one of those things that then, as I look back on my career at college, I realized that anytime I could put a chapel into a project or anytime that I could in any way, choose what I wanted to do, I always ended up doing a church. And so it's kind of, looking back, it's like, yes, you always wanted to be a church architect. But it just so happens that by divine providence, more than anything, when I was graduating from college, there were not a lot of jobs. This was 2010. So it was right after the 2008 financial crisis. Most firms were not
Yes.
hiring. And they told us
Yes.
that, but it just so happened that one of the firms here in town was looking for one person and it was for their church studio. And the reason that
Mm.
the dean thought of me was because my senior thesis was to design a church in Galveston. That was the one project I got to pick, and that's what I picked. And he remembered.
Excellent.
And that's how I got to do an interview and got into this whole business of church architecture. And from there, I absolutely fell in love with it. Love working with committees and learning to just get to know communities, pastors, and the impact that they have on everyday life. So that's how I got started in it.
It's a great path you have trodden along this journey here. I've been to Rome 8 times in my life, and it's my favorite city in the world because of the architecture and the design of some of the basilicas and the churches. And even in Mexico, I remember doing some business in Mexico, in Guadalajara in particular. I saw
Oh
a lot
yeah.
of buildings that were very beautiful. So architecture, church architecture, we have both seen, and I know you're more expert than I am at this, but we've seen, ugly buildings,
Oh yeah.
including in the church world. And and I know that I believe that beauty is an objective factor, not a subjective thing. But how do you put into practice the knowledge of the faith that you have and all of the treasures, the rich treasures of the church's history of beauty and portraying things? How do you actually do that? Does it come from your own creative sense? Is it an impulse that comes from the committees that you work with? Let's say somebody comes to you and says, design me a church, Raphael. How does that process work in the creative mind?
Sure, sure. So really, architects are obviously known for being creative, but ultimately, I
Yes.
think that we are most creative when we have really good limits imposed on ourselves. So
Yes.
a true blank page where you tell me like you have all the money in the world and you can do whatever you want, that would actually be a really hard thing to decide what it was that we needed to do, right? Because it's actually the constraint placed upon us that allows the most creativity to flourish. So what I would say if you came to me and said, I'd like a church design is at first say, well, there is a pattern that is ordained by the church, that is actually ordained by God biblically, that tells us how to build a church, right? So it's not up to us to just
Mm.
come up with whatever shape we want, but that there is a pattern that has been used. I mean, going all the way back, to the Jewish temple that begins to
Mm.
establish a relationship between architecture and God. And then obviously in the light of Christ in the New Testament, that is refined and that is advanced and developed. And we see that in the early Christian basilicas, many of which you see in Rome. But you see that there is a pattern that begins to develop of this kind of long rectangular building that has an axis to it. It has a definite front and a definite hierarchy. So the altar being the most important part of a church because it represents Christ. And that even the orientation of the church, historically churches have faced east because east is that
Yes.
cosmological sign of the resurrection. So you begin to see that there are these patterns that are very firmly established by the church. And far from it being something limiting that means that every church looks the same, you can see how throughout history, that same pattern is what develops into, yes, Romanesque, but goes into the Gothic, goes into the Renaissance, and all the way down to the modern day. So there was no limit to the level of creativity when your design is informed by those sacred patterns that the church gives us. So that's kind of the universal patterns that we have to apply. But then when you're working with a particular committee or community, you realize that there is a local expression of the faith. So, again, I'm from Mexico. So Mexican Catholicism looks a little bit different than German Catholicism or French Catholicism or Canadian,
Yes.
and so on. And there's a
Right.
beauty to that, right? There's a beauty to the fact that in each place in the world, there's a different expression. And in a certain sense, it's because God became man and dwelt among us, and he came to a specific place in a specific time. And so naturally, as the church develops in different parts of the world, the architecture will reflect that unique character of each community. So for me as an architect, it's great fun to get to know communities, to get to introduce them to these sacred patterns of the church, but then together bring out what's going to be that special character that will communicate the reality of the faith in this specific time, in this specific place. So that's a lot of fun.
Well, it's very gratifying to hear that. I remember a book that I once read called How Christ Said the First Mass. And it was really an expose. I'll send you the name of the title, or
Yeah.
but it's a book that described the setup of the temple and how much of that was copied, you might say, or
Yeah.
translated into
Yeah.
Catholic mass and the design of churches. So I know you'd be familiar with that, but I was quite struck by that when I first learned that many years ago. It was amazing to me.
Absolutely.
You know,
Yeah.
Raphael, there's another aspect to it. Naturally, there are. Uh, you've said something very powerful. I think freedom comes from that restriction, you might say. And that's, of
Right.
course, the study of our faith, right? We have commandments and precepts and rules. And if we live within that, we have ultimate freedom. If we don't, and we try to go secular freedom, we find that it's a tragedy and it's a loss. So when you are faced with that kind of a constraint, then there's the financial question. And I know many people are always interested to know, how do you then reconcile everything you've just said with the financial reality? Okay, maybe we can't afford what what you've just told us we could do, Raphael.
Right.
Actually, we only
Right.
need half the budget for that. How do you deal with that? It's a challenge, I'm sure. And how do you grapple with
For sure. Yeah. No, I mean, it's a reality of every client. I've never had a client that said, I have all the money in the world.
that?
You can do whatever you want,
Right.
so it's always like, again, a budget being another one of those constraints that we have to work within, and that, a good architect will use to his advantage instead of as a limitation. But really it's again, going back and looking at how churches have been built throughout history. And what you find is of course, they were often built in phases, right? Like no, there's very few examples of a church that was just all built in one go. You go visit those beautiful churches in Rome or even here in the United States. And what you have to realize is that it is generations of effort that you're witnessing at once, right? But those churches didn't start out looking like that. That over time, each successive generation would contribute to the church and beautify it, and each generation would kind of offer up that kind of beautification as part of what is a long history of development for any given building. So an example here in the United States is, and I will say that, actually, I'll give an example first in Paris. So Notre Dame in Paris, which just reopened, of course,
Yes.
um,
Yes.
took 800 years to build, so you can imagine, you know, sometimes I struggle to think that our society could decide to work on something for 800 years, but yet that society did, right? They chose to again and again continue that work of building that magnificent building that we have today and that we get to enjoy. But here in the United States, it's similar. I mean, I think of the Cathedral of St. Paul in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and it's a
Yes.
magnificent building, a kind of a German classical building. But when it first opened, none of its interior decoration was built. It was very, what we would say, sparse, like there just wasn't a lot there. But yet the proportions and the overall bones of the building were in place for future generations to come and finish the work. And so I think that we need to once again think about our churches in this way. We've kind of succumbed to what some people call the microwave society, where we want things to be done and to be done now. But we have to grow a certain patience in building these beautiful buildings and realize that they're multi-generational efforts and not just, quick things that we throw up. But if they're going to be here and last, then we have to have the patience to build them.
I have to tell you that I've personally experienced my own tendency to want to microwave, like you say. It's a true story. The Clear Creek Abbey.
Mm,
I go there on a regular basis. I know the abbot very well. I'm his personal friend, and I'm an advisor to him, if I could say.
yeah.
But
Mm,
his big basilica church is not finished, and they've been at it for 25 years. And I'm going to tell you that my first advice to him was, Father Abbott, you have to go raise 100 million and finish this thing. Well,
yeah.
I think maybe he's going to do that. I don't know, but right now the crypt chapel is in place, and then the main structure, the walls are up. The roof is just a temporary tin roof. The tower isn't up. The quadrangle isn't finished. And so they can only hold their um, liturgies of the hours in the spring and the fall, because in the summer it's blazing hot in that upper part. And in the winter it's
Yeah.
free and there's no heat in there. So my tendency was to hurry, let's get this done. Let's raise 100 million and let's finish it. But there may be a flaw in my logic because of what you've just said. It's a journey, it's a path, it's a religious experience, and maybe that's the answer to my tendency.
Right. Right. I mean, obviously it's always in moderation within reason, right? Because while the monks can suffer through those kinds of changes in weather, a parish church may not be in that position, right? But nonetheless, I think there is a lot to be learned from the idea that you can phase, especially beautification, decoration, But even design churches that can be expanded. We have many examples of communities change over time, and rather than having to tear down your church and start completely over, what if we designed them in such a way that they could be expanded, right? So yeah, there's definitely some wisdom in that.
Yeah, exactly. So, Raphael, then let's say that there are students all over the country interested in the profession of architecture and perhaps church architecture and so on. What is your advice to the up and coming smart young person, man or woman, young man or young woman that really wants to follow this? In some ways, it seems that you're in a narrow field. It's a very specialized and narrow field. How would someone prepare if they were in school today or in high school, let's say, studying about college, thinking about where to go for architecture? How would you get them on the path to being a guy like you that has his own firm and is really specializing in church architecture?
Great question. Great question. So I think, looking back on my years of working and of what has made the biggest impact on my preparation, for that first church I got to design, and what helped me to know where to start. And really, I would pinpoint two major things. One is to just make a habit of visiting beautiful churches,
Oh,
so
yes. Yes.
planning pilgrimages anytime you go on vacation with your family or by yourself, just charting an itinerary, finding out what the beautiful churches in that town are, and then go visit them. See as many of them as you can, because I think that the biggest single thing you can do to improve yourself as a designer is to visit beautiful churches and beautiful buildings, and to really, I had a professor tell me that anytime you come into a beautiful building, there's a tendency for you to be obviously in awe and have a certain amount of
Yes.
reverence for the building.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's natural and that's a good thing, right? That means it's a good building. But he said, that's well and good. Take a moment, but then try to figure out how did they do it. You know? So when you walk into a building that takes your breath away, take a moment, but then begin to think, okay, what is it about this building that creates this moment that I'm having? Is it the geometry? Is it the volume, the space? Is there a certain amount of
Mm.
detail that's there? It's obviously a combination of all of it, but as best you can to pinpoint what that is as you visit
Mhm.
different churches. And, that begins to collect in your mind as a designer. And then you're able to draw upon these examples when it's time for you to design a church. So that was a really big, and I continue to do that. It's an ongoing, learning process that hopefully I will continue until the end of my career and then beyond. But so that's one of the things. The other that I think is just as critical is actually to participate in the life of a parish that has a really robust liturgical life, which, should be a given. In theory, should be a given. But I've been, I have had the pleasure now to be a part of the ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter, specifically at the Cathedral of Our Lady of Walsingham here in Houston, and to be
Yes.
able to be part of the tradition that the ordinariate offers, and to, day in and day out, participate in the liturgy, participate in the various, parish activities, festivals, feast days. You begin to develop a sense of tradition and how you relate to it. So we have to realize that ultimately the liturgy is that great source and summit of the Christian life, as the
Yes.
Second Vatican Council says. And so to
Yes.
be a good church architect is to fully and actively and kind of, really place yourself into this rich liturgical life so that you know what the end is of what you're designing. And so for me, that has been a huge revelation that, as I am able to participate in this beautiful liturgical life, it impacts how I think about church design, and it informs it, and in a certain sense, gives it a much deeper meaning than it would otherwise be, because there's a temptation to almost make architecture too academic, and only think about it from the outside in, as opposed to being inside of this tradition and then thinking about what a building looks like that gives flesh, if you will, to the tradition that you're participating in. So those two things for me are foundational for how to design a beautiful church.
Raphael, I was a couple of weeks ago, I attended a class that my daughter teaches at the University of St. Thomas.
Mhm.
And the topic happened to be beauty. And there was discussion of Roger Scruton and some of the other thinkers about beauty. So I'm going to ask you the most unfair question of all. What is beauty? How do you define beauty in church design?
Yeah, no, it's obviously a deep question. A lot of people have thought
We
about
only
it.
have 10 seconds to answer it.
That's right. That's right. Well, I mean, first and foremost, the idea of beauty is, I think it was John Paul II that said, beauty is the visible form of the good. So I think that's a good place to start. Or the architect Gaudi said, beauty is the splendor of truth.
Mm.
So that's another one that I like. But I think beauty ultimately is that attribute of God that draws us into his inner life. So it is kind of the radiance of the love of God. And so, in because obviously you find beauty in everything, right? Beauty in nature, beauty in architecture, beauty in people. And all of that ultimately leads us back to God. There was a French philosopher, which I can't remember her name, but very interesting quote by her, which they asked her, what is the purpose of art? And I would extend it to what is the purpose of architecture? And her response was to reveal God in all things. So that's what beauty is supposed to be, a revelation of God in the everyday that shakes us, that takes us out of our normal routine and makes us realize that there's more to our life than just what's right in front of us. So,
And it's so amazing what you've just said because, again, for our audience, I have seen Raphael's work in person and I have traveled the halls of a certain building that he has worked on. And I can tell you that, I feel that you immerse yourself in that building just as you have described. And it's a beautiful building, a structure. It's got its utility and it serves a purpose, but there's something that's more elevating about it. It does lift my mind and heart when I walk into that structure. And so I think I
thank
know
you.
what you're talking
Thank
about.
you.
If I last couple of questions, our time is always so limited and there's so much we could talk about, but last couple of questions. If you had a dream project, this is an unfair question too, but what would be a dream project for you to do in terms of church architecture?
I mean, I think ultimately the dream project for a church architect is a cathedral, just because of,
Yes.
of what it represents, right? Obviously, the mother church of a diocese, but also in a certain sense, it is the church to which all of the parish churches look to for the example to follow. And if
Yes.
the church is ultimately a vision of the heavenly Jerusalem, in the cathedral we find that in its most kind of exalted form, right? So when you come upon a cathedral, you really feel like you're coming upon the gate of the heavenly Jerusalem, and to walk in its nave and to go through its side chapels. It's like finding a little corner of heaven where you are lost and kind of swept up into this beautiful vision of heaven. So that for me would be an absolute dream project.
Well, I look forward to the day when that could happen. I would really love to see that. I'll close today by asking you, how do we support you? Because beauty and truth and goodness in the work that you do is something to be treasured and it's to be uplifted. How do we help you? Is there a project we could help look at? Is there a website? Are there works? Do you have a portfolio that you could show us so that how do people support you?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. I mean, I would say, first and foremost, supporting me by your prayers, so we are in the, we've started this new firm, and the firm's intent and the firm's focus is to try to bring sacred beauty and sacred architecture to as many parishes as we can. Sometimes I think parishes can feel like beauty is outside of their reach, or that it's something that's only for the big parishes that have money. But I really want to make it our mission to bring beauty to all parishes of any size and of any economic level. So your prayers are much appreciated as we try to build a team around this mission. But also, I would say, we can all be patrons of the arts, patrons of architecture, by being
Yes.
informed, by knowing about it, and by promoting it. So in your parish, if you do hear that there might be a campaign to build something, or even if there isn't, but if there's opportunities for beautification, speak up. Don't think that beauty is something that is optional or something that is not necessary. Because I think what we have learned, especially in the last 40 years of being kind of, having been stuck with some of these, let's just say not as beautiful churches, we have found that no, beauty is essential. We need it. And so speak up, and really become an advocate for beauty in your churches. And then, yes, if you're looking for a good architect to be a partner with you as you move forward with some of these endeavors, our website is cosmatiarchitects.com. Cosmati is Cosmati. And just to tell a brief story as to why we picked that name. So
Yes,
Cosmati
please.
and it was an Italian family in the Rome area, so in central Italy. And it was a family in the Middle Ages that were sculptors, architects, and church decorators. And perhaps the most famous of the work that they did is if you go to the great Roman basilicas. So, whether it's St. Mary Major, for example, and you look down at the floor, there's an inlaid marble pattern, that's kind of a serpentine pattern that has
Yes.
beautiful multicolored marble pieces. Well, that type of pattern is called Cosmati. And so we named our firm after this family and after this type of pattern, because we want to communicate our commitment to tradition and to craftsmanship, to beautiful design, but most importantly to our Catholic faith. And so if you would like to support us, please visit our website, and we'd be happy to talk to you about any potential project and be of whatever help we can to you. So thank you.
Thanks for telling us all of that. I want to just maybe extend our time just for another moment, because I know people who are interested in having a room in their house as dedicated as a chapel, for example.
Yeah,
And I would dare say that they should come and talk to you about that too, not to mention basilica
absolutely.
cathedrals. So, because I think there's a tendency for us to, I think I hear more people wanting to do this in their home. And it's not just the bigger and larger homes where there's the space available, but I think people want to even create a corner that's not just an ordinary altar or home altar, but something that's quite beautiful and has these design features. So I just thought I'd throw that in as well. So
Absolutely. I'd be happy to.
I think it's important that we do talk to you and support you in your work, because aside from the priesthood and the sacraments and the faith, the place of worship, the church buildings can lift our minds and hearts to God, and you're doing that. So I appreciate that you're with us today. Thank you very much for doing this. God bless you in all of your works, and I hope that we'll talk again one of these days. Thanks again, Rafael.
Thank you so much, Henry. Appreciate it.
God bless.